There are going to be some things that you'll come to learn about me in the next. The text comes in from Marisol, a regular from the old days. Someone you haven't spoken to in almost 2 years, except for the occasional holiday message. It's just a screenshot, no caption, a blurry photo of a page from the local business journal's Tuesday roundup. The small print section near the back, where they list openings and closings nobody reads unless they're looking for something specific. One line easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. A name you know or phrase in quotes next to it. Unsustainable operations model attributed to the owner when asked for comment. You read it standing in your own kitchen, coffee halfway made, and the first thing you feel isn't what you'd expect, not triumph. Something closer to static, a kind of full-body pause, like your system needs a second to confirm the sentence actually says what it appears to say, before it lets you have any reaction to it at all. Here's the part worth going back to because none of this means anything without it. 4 years ago, the person named in that online blurb worked for you. Not as a partner, not as a co-founder, just an employee good at the job. Sharp in the way people are sharp when they're paying close attention to everything around them, including things they weren't hired to pay attention to. They watched how you sourced things, watched how you priced them, watched the specific unglamorous choices you'd made over years, which suppliers to trust and which to avoid, which slower, more expensive way of doing something actually mattered to the people who kept coming back. About me in the next few days. I just want you to know that no. And which corners looked cuttable to an outsider but weren't. Not really. Not if you wanted the whole thing to hold together the way it had taken you years to get it to hold together. You remember training them actually back in the first few months, walking through the reasoning behind decisions that had nothing to do with their actual job description, because you've always believed people work better when they understand the why and not just the what. You explain why you stuck with the slower supplier even though a cheaper one existed 2 towns over. You explain why certain corners that looked cosmetic to an outsider actually mattered enormously to the handful of customers who'd been with you since the beginning. The ones who'd notice instantly if something shifted even slightly. You didn't think of any of that as handing over a blueprint. You thought of it as being a decent manager, the kind who explains reasoning instead of just issuing instructions. It never occurred to you at the time that someone could take the why along with the what and eventually build their own version out of both. They left on a Friday, gave 2 weeks notice that felt a little too smooth, a little too rehearsed, and opened their own version 4 months later, 6 blocks away. Same layout, near enough that it couldn't have been accidental. Same supplier relationships, at least the ones they could poach outright. Same pricing structure undercut by just enough to make the difference feel meaningful to anyone comparing on paper. Even some of the same language and the marketing phrases you'd spent actual time workshopping showing up in their copy with just enough of a rewrite to avoid being an exact match. You remember the specific sting of hearing secondhand what they'd apparently been saying to mutual acquaintances in the run-up to opening, that you overcomplicated things. That half of what you insisted on, the slower sourcing, the extra step in quality control, the relationships you maintained with suppliers, even when it would have been cheaper to switch, was you being precious about a business that didn't need to be run that carefully? That the whole thing could be done leaner, faster, and just as well by someone who wasn't so attached to doing it the hard way. No matter how it may look, I only had you in my heart. Chemistry is. For a while, it looked like they might be right. That's the part I don't want to skip past, because skipping past it would make the rest of this too easy. Their first year did well. Some of your longtime customers went to check it out, drawn by the lower prices and the novelty, and a handful of them stayed there for good. You lost income you'd budgeted around. You lost a little bit of your own certainty too, in the specific way that watching someone succeed by dismissing the thing you were careful about makes you quietly wonder whether the carefulness was ever actually necessary or just a story you told yourself to justify doing things the harder way. You kept going anyway, not out of some steady, unshaken confidence. That would be a nicer story than the true one. You kept going because stopping felt worse than continuing. And because some part of you, even in the uncertain months, still believed the slower choices meant something. Even if you couldn't have proven it to anyone watching from outside, you didn't get to skip the 2 years where it genuinely felt like being careful might have just meant being slower to lose. Those 2 years had a specific texture to them if you go back and actually remember the daily version instead of the summarized one. There was a Tuesday afternoon, maybe 8 months into their operation, when you sat with your own numbers spread out on the counter after close and did the math twice, because you didn't like the answer the first time. There was the specific discomfort of a longtime customer mentioning casually, without any cruelty intended, that she'd tried the new place and thought it was basically the same, honestly, and a bit cheaper. A sentence that shouldn't have stung as much as it did, and stung anyway for days. There was the quiet, private arithmetic of wondering whether you should match their prices, cut the same corners, stop being the version of this business that took the extra step nobody outside ever seemed to notice or reward. You didn't. Some of that was principle. Some of it, if you're honest, was just not having the stomach to become something else on top of everything else that year already required of you. Here's the thing about copying a business. Well, technically, chemistry is the study of matter that almost nobody talks about because it's not visible from the outside, the way a menu or a price list is visible. You can copy the parts that show up on a receipt. You cannot copy the reason a particular supplier still takes your calls personally after 9 years. The accumulated trust that has nothing to do with the invoice and everything to do with the 100 small moments of you doing right by them when it would have been easier not to. You cannot copy the specific instinct built slowly over years of paying close attention, for which shortcuts actually cost you nothing and which ones quietly poison the whole thing 18 months down the line in ways that don't show up on a spreadsheet until it's already too late to reverse. It's a little like a cover band that's learned every note of a song perfectly, hits every chord change exactly where the original does, and still can't explain why the original was written in a minor key to begin with. The notes are copyable. The reason underneath the notes usually isn't without living through whatever it was that made someone choose that key in the first place. Your competitor learned the notes. They were good at learning notes. Genuinely, that's not nothing, and I'm not going to pretend the copy was talentless. What they never had access to was the reasoning underneath it. The years of specific, unglamorous decisions that only make sense once you understand what they were protecting against. And by the time that gap started to matter, it had already been baked into a business built to look identical from the outside, while missing the load-bearing parts you couldn't see just by watching from 6 blocks away. Think about what actually happens to a cover band like that. On the nights the room goes quiet in a way it isn't supposed to. The chords are right, the tempo's right, and still some nights the song just doesn't land the way the original does. And nobody in the audience could tell you exactly why. Because the reason isn't in anything you could point to on a set list. It's in the 6 months the original songwriter spent stuck on a single verse. The specific heartbreak or doubt that shaped which note came before which. All of it invisible, now folded into the finished song so completely that it just sounds like the song rather than like a decision anyone made on purpose. A cover band can reproduce the decision. They can't reproduce the 6 months that produced it. That gap doesn't show up in rehearsal. It shows up later quietly in whether the thing actually holds up over time or just holds up long enough to sound convincing at first. Listen. That's the part your former employee never got to see because by the time they left, they'd only ever watched the finished version of your business. The version where all the hard decisions had already been made and simply looked from the outside like the natural, obvious way to run things. They didn't watch the specific supplier fall through in year 2 and the scramble that taught you which backup relationships actually mattered to build in advance. They didn't sit with the customer complaint in year 3 that reshaped an entire process quietly, invisibly, so completely that by year 4 it just looked like the process had always been that way. They inherited the shape of the song without any of the 6 months that shaped it, and they built their own version on top of that shape, confident it would hold. Because from where they were standing, it looked like it always had. I don't know the specific chain of decisions that led to that online blurb in the business journal. Neither do you probably, and it's worth being honest about that instead of filling in a satisfying story you can't actually confirm. Maybe it was the supplier relationships fraying once the poached ones realized the new operation didn't have the same patience for the slow parts. Maybe it was the pricing structure finally catching up with itself. The margin that looked fine on a spreadsheet turning out to be too thin once real costs crept in the way they always eventually do. Maybe it was something else entirely, something neither of you will ever know the full shape of. What you do know is the 2 words the owner apparently offered when a reporter called for comment. Unsustainable operations, not the market changed, not we made some mistakes. A phrase clinical enough to describe a structure that couldn't hold its own weight, which is, in its own dry, unglamorous way, close enough to the truth that it barely needs translating. A supplier you both used back when they were still buying from the same people you were mentioned. Something to you a few months back before any of this became public, said carefully in the tactful way people talk when they don't want to seem like they're taking sides, that the new operation had started asking for terms it couldn't really support, faster payment on their end, slower on the receiving end, the kind of arrangement that works fine for a few months and then starts to strain everyone involved once it becomes a habit instead of an exception. You didn't think much of it at the time beyond a small private flicker of something you didn't examine too closely. It's only now, rereading Marisol's screenshot, that the comment sits differently, like a puzzle piece you didn't know you were still holding until the rest of the picture showed up to meet it. I want to slow down on something because it would be easy to let this become a story about revenge, and I don't think that's actually what's sitting underneath it. You didn't do anything to cause this. You didn't send an anonymous tip to a reporter. Didn't undercut them back. Didn't spend the last 4 years working toward this outcome in any active sense. You just kept doing the thing you were already doing the slow, careful, sometimes doubted way, while somewhere else, a faster version of the same idea ran its own course on its own timeline according to its own internal logic, completely independent of anything you did. That's actually the part worth sitting with longest. This isn't a story about you winning a fight. It's a story about 2 different sets of choices playing out to their natural conclusions on parallel tracks, without either of you needing to interfere with the other at all. Think about what it actually took to keep choosing the slower way during the 2 years it looked like. The faster way was winning. Nobody handed you proof back then that patience was the correct strategy. You didn't have this blurb yet. You didn't have any of this. You just had a private sense that the corners you weren't cutting mattered alongside real evidence in your own declining numbers. That at least some of the market disagreed with you. Holding a belief like that unconfirmed while watching a faster competitor pull ahead on paper costs something specific and largely invisible. It's not dramatic. It's just the daily unglamorous discipline of not abandoning a slower method because a faster one is temporarily winning and doing that without any guarantee that the slower method would eventually be vindicated at all. Marisol's text doesn't undo those 2 years. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to let this one blurry screenshot erase the actual cost of what you went through. While it looked like being careful was losing, it doesn't erase the customers you lost or the months you spent quietly wondering if you'd been foolish to stick with the harder way of doing things. What it does is smaller and maybe more useful, precisely because it's smaller. It confirms in dry 2-word business journal language that the load-bearing parts of what you built were never decorative. They were structural. And structures built without understanding why they're shaped the way they are tend to hold for a while, right up until the specific weight they weren't built for finally arrives. You'll probably run into them eventually. In the way small industries make running into people eventually unavoidable, a shared supplier's holiday event, a trade show, a mutual contacts gathering where you both happen to be invited. When that happens, there won't be some cinematic confrontation, no speech, no moment where you get to recite the 2 words back to them the way it might play out if this were a different kind of story. Most likely, it'll just be a slightly too long silence. A handshake that lasts half a second shorter than it should, both of you aware of the blurb in the business journal without either of you saying its name out loud. That's usually how these things actually resolve between adults who used to know each other. Not with a scene, with an ordinary room that suddenly has one more unspoken thing sitting quietly in it. You'll probably keep doing the same slow, careful things tomorrow that you were doing before this text ever came through. The sourcing calls, the extra step nobody outside the business would ever notice. The relationships you maintain because they're the actual foundation and not because anyone's watching you maintain them. Nothing about today changes tomorrow's work. It just means you get to do that work now without the quiet background hum of wondering whether the faster version down the street was secretly the smarter one all along. It wasn't. It just took longer than either of you expected for the difference between copying the notes and understanding the key to become visible enough for a reporter to write it.